Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Today I invite you into a legend that rises from the churning depths of a world lost to time, where the gods' mercy was outweighed by their righteous fury. A saga of a great cleansing that the tides have been carrying to our shores for millennia. This story doesn't just tell of the silence on the gods' thrones, it tells of the last heartbeat of a corrupted era and the first gasps of two lonely survivors clinging to hope amidst an endless grey sea. We are following the footsteps of Deucalion and Pyrrha, the only ones deemed worthy in a world where humanity's heart had turned to stone, standing at the edge of the world's end. This is a story of a divine trial that began with the hubris of kings and the chilling transformation of Lycaon into a beast of the night. But it is also a story of a new dawn rising from the ruins of the Iron Age. Witness the moment when Zeus set aside his thunderbolts for the unrelenting power of the waves, turning the earth into a vast, silent tomb only to pave the way for a miracle. In a fate where every mountain peak became an island and every forest a sunken memory, you will see how ancient stones cast by pious hands softened into the warm flesh of a new generation. Disclaimer: the visuals in this video were created using artificial intelligence. There are no bloody or disturbing scenes. However, some moments have been designed for cinematic and emotional depth. If you are sensitive to such imagery, please keep this in mind before watching. If you wish to join me on these mythic journeys, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and leave a comment below telling me which story you'd like to explore next. I look forward to sailing through these timeless tales together, one legend at a time. Take a deep breath, relax your mind, and let the rhythm of the waves guide you, wishing you a peaceful sleep. The epic of the Deukalion Flood, Noah's Flood in Greek mythology, begins now. When the world was still in its infancy, in that pitch-dark age of chaos when the shores of the seas had not yet been battered by fierce claws and the sky had wrapped the earth like a gentle veil, everything had consisted of a shapeless, heavy and blind mass called chaos. In that absolute silence, no being had possessed its own true form. Cold had battled heat, wet had struggled against dry, and soft had clashed endlessly with hard in an unceasing war of existence. Yet a supreme creative force that had flowed from the womb of time untied the knots of this cosmic confusion one by one. It had lifted fire to the highest heavens, beside the stars. It had spread air beneath it like a thin veil, and it had gathered the heavy earth at the center into the heart of the universe. In the midst of this fresh order, Prometheus, the proud son of Olympus, stepped forward to create that being of superior thinking ability whose absence had been felt in the world. Prometheus had taken that fresh earth, which still carried sacred particles of the sky within its veins, and had kneaded it with clear rainwater, as if he had been shaping a work of art. The clay that had come to life between his fingers had taken on the majestic likeness of the gods who ruled the universe. While all other living beings had been created with their heads bowed, able to see only the dark soil before them, Prometheus had granted humans a proud and upright posture. He had commanded them to turn their faces toward the shining stars and to watch the boundless sky like explorers. Thus, that lifeless earth had suddenly transformed into the unknown and mysterious form of humankind. In those times, Kronos had ruled the heavens, and the world had rested in the embrace of that flawless fairy tale happiness called the Golden Age. These first humans had lived honestly, guided by a virtue rising from the depths of their souls, without any laws, coercion, or fear of punishment. No mighty pine tree had yet been torn from its mountain home and launched into raging waters to conquer foreign lands. People had known only their own peaceful shores. No deep moats had been dug around cities. The chilling sound of war trumpets had not been heard, and tools of destruction such as helmets and swords had not yet found a place in human minds. The earth, unwounded by plough marks and unscarred by iron rakes, had offered everything generously and freely, with the tenderness of a mother. Milk and nectar had flowed from springs, and golden honey had dripped like treasure from the hollows of green oaks. However, when Kronos had been driven into the depths of dark Tartarus, and absolute rule of the universe had passed into the hands of Zeus, this peaceful dream had given way to a harsher reality, the Silver Age. Zeus had shortened that endless eternal spring. He had divided the year into 4 seasons: the frost of winter, the heat of summer, the changeability of autumn, and a brief spring. He had scorched the air with burning heat and had woven sharp icicles with the breath of the winds. Then humanity had needed shelter for the first time against nature's fury. Instead of caves and thickets, they had built their first homes from tree bark. The first seeds had been buried in the bosom of the earth, and gentle oxen, groaning in pain under the yoke, had ploughed the first fields. After the Silver Age, the people of the Bronze Age appeared fiercer in nature, more inclined toward violent conflict, yet not completely corrupted. This generation had marked the time when those noble beings, shaped by Prometheus's hands, had reached for violence for the first time, and when peace had slowly given way to tension. Yet the true great disaster had stood at the door with the Iron Age, when every kind of evil had poured onto the earth like a burst dam. With the darkness of the Iron Age, honesty, shame, and honor had withdrawn from the earth like fading shadows. Their absence had been filled by deceit, betrayal, cunning, and sinister desires. Sailors, though they had not yet deciphered the language of the sky, had cut down ancient pines, built massive ships, and faced the terror of unknown waves. Land that had once been a shared inheritance like sunlight or the air people breathed had now been confined within boundaries by greedy hands and measuring tools. Humans had not been content to ask the earth only for the bread that was their due. They had torn into its privacy and brought to light the gold and iron hidden in the darkness of the Styx, metals that drove humans toward crime and madness. When iron and the even more poisonous gold had emerged, warriors with blood-stained hands had used these metals to drive them into one another's hearts. Humanity had turned into a monster that fed on plunder. A guest could no longer trust a host, nor a father-in-law a son-in-law. The bond of brotherhood had snapped like a thin thread. Terrible stepmothers had boiled poisonous herbs in secret cauldrons, and children had stared into their father's eyes, counting their remaining days so they could seize their inheritances sooner. The earth had been soaked with the blood of the innocent. Piety and fear of the gods had been erased from souls. Even the sky had not escaped the rage of this corruption. Giants had tried to storm the kingdom of the gods by piling mountains upon one another and climbing toward the heavens. But Zeus had shaken the peaks of Olympus with his thundering lightning and had buried these raging giants deep within the earth. Mother Earth had formed a new human likeness from this soil watered with the blood of her children. Yet this new race had been even worse than before, a generation that despised the gods and thirsted for savagery. Up to that point, only the Virgin Astrea, Justice herself, had remained among the immortals who had tried to warn and watch over humanity. She too had finally been unable to endure watching this world turned into a sea of blood and this endless evil. and she had become the last immortal to leave the earth. Humanity had sunk into the pitch-black darkness of corruption, recognizing no moral limits, leaving the altars of the gods empty and slaughtering one another. Watching this horrific scene from the highest and most unreachable fortress of the sky, Zeus had been shaken by a groan torn from his chest. Whenever he had remembered the vile feast he had witnessed at the table of Lycaon, king of Arcadia, the offering of human flesh to the gods, his mind had burned with uncontrollable fury. He had summoned the gods to an urgent council. Passing along the silvery path of the Milky Way into Zeus's marble halls, the gods had watched in terror as their king struck his golden scepter to the ground 3 times. Then a 4th time, each blow shaking the earth, the sky, and the seas. Zeus had parted his lips and had shouted his irreversible and dreadful decision. Wherever the waters of Nereus have surrounded the world, I must destroy the entire human race forever. A fearful murmur had risen among the gods. Some had submitted to and approved the decision, while others had anxiously whispered about who would offer incense at their altars after humanity's destruction and whether the beautiful world would be left to the mercy of wild beasts. Yet Zeus had calmed them. He had promised, according to his ancient word, that he would completely wipe out the present corrupted race and then bring forth, through a miraculous creation, a new and pure people, unlike the former. Humanity had strayed from that sacred beginning, brought to life by Prometheus's hands, had sold its soul to darkness, and had been left in absolute orphanhood with Astria's departure. What would pour down from the sky now would not be only merciful rain, but the flood of the gods' endless wrath toward this rotten world. The upright human created by Prometheus had written his own end through his own arrogance. While the world had become unable to breathe under the heavy, rusted burden of the Iron Age that had settled upon it, Zeus, the absolute ruler of the heavens and the unshakable fortress of Olympus, had watched the corruption of the earth from his ivory throne. Cries claiming that the human race had completely strayed from virtue and that piety and the goddess of justice, Astrea, had abandoned the earth never to return, had drifted through the clouds of Olympus and reached his ears. Yet the great god had wished to see with his own eyes that these dreadful reports had not been mere echoes, and to understand how deeply the roots of evil had sunk into the soil. Leaving the radiant peaks behind, he had set aside his divine splendor and decided to descend to the dusty roads below in the guise of a mortal. He had hidden his majestic scepter and his lightning bolts that could turn worlds to ash among the clouds, and he had taken on the appearance of an ordinary, weary traveler or a poor day laborer chasing his daily bread. Zeus's aim had been to test with his own eyes whether the darkness in humanity's heart had truly been as pitch black as it had been described. The king of the gods had crossed, one by one, the Manala mountains echoing with savage claws and hungry howls, the steep and impassable slopes of Cyllene, and the pine forests of Lycaeus, whispering with freezing winds. His feet had ached like those of every mortal who walked upon the earth, and his face had been scorched by the sun's burning lash and the harsh chill of the wind. Yet he had been the ruler who held the pulse of the universe in his palm. At last, when the black cloak of night had spread over the earth, he had arrived at the gates of the palace of Lycaon, the prideful king of Arcadia, a palace ignorant of the sacred laws of hospitality. Lycaon had been known as more arrogant, more impious, and more cruel than any mortal who had ever walked the earth. Moreover, This dark legacy had been inherited by his 50 sons, each competing to surpass their father in pride and disrespect. Zeus had taken his first step across the threshold of the palace to test the limits of this accursed dynasty. As Zeus had glided into the dim halls of the palace, he had begun to let seep out those inexplicable, mysterious signs that made others sense the presence of a god. The dignified gravity radiating from his steps had stirred a sudden shiver in the souls of the people. Instinctively, they had knelt in reverence, offering prayers and beginning to worship this stranger. However, the impiety that had seeped into the palace walls had been so deeply rooted that Lycaon had mocked the people's naive piety with a scornful laugh. Waving his arrogance like a banner, the king had shouted, "I will prove, with a bloody test that leaves no doubt, whether this visitor is a god or merely a mortal who has lost his way." To weigh Zeus's divinity, Lycaon had begun to weave in his mind one of the darkest and most disgusting plans in history. The king's plan had been not only an insult to the gods, but also a trampling of the most fundamental sacred values that made a human being human. Lycaon had first planned to kill his guest at the most defenseless moment of sleep, in the blind darkness of midnight, to see whether he would die. Yet even this brutality had failed to quench the thirst for evil within him. He had wanted to become the architect of a feast that would sicken even the gods. In the palace, an innocent youth captured from the people of Molossia had been held prisoner. The king had ordered this wretch brought out from the cold walls of the dungeon and had slit his throat with the cold detachment of a butcher. According to some accounts, this victim had been a local child still in the spring of life. Lycaon had cut apart the limbs of the poor victim while they had still been warm, boiling some of the flesh in blazing cauldrons and roasting the rest over glowing fires. When this horrific feast had been prepared, he had placed these dishes made of human flesh at the head of the table and served them to his guest, who claimed to be a god. Lycaon had wondered whether his guest would notice this abomination. If he did not, it would have proven that he had been an ordinary mortal. However, Zeus, with his all-seeing and all-knowing eyes, had recognized this vile trap even before the table had been set. Zeus's wrath had exploded suddenly, like a massive bolt of lightning splitting the sky in two. When the ruler of Olympus had seen the sacred law of hospitality stained by such a hideous murder, the flames of vengeance had descended upon Lycaon's palace like a nightmare. As the palace's magnificent roof had collapsed like a tombstone upon the impious king, Zeus's lightning bolts had turned Lycaon's sons and the household gods of the palace into handfuls of ash. Lycaon had begun to flee toward the desolate fields ruled by night in great terror and animal fear. Each time he had opened his mouth to beg for forgiveness or plead for mercy, no human words had fallen from his lips. Only a chilling, ferocious howl tearing through the silence of the night had risen instead. The savage lust for bloodshed within the king's soul had now begun to rule his body as well. Lycaon's silk garments had suddenly turned into coarse, stiff, grey fur, and his arms had become clawed legs. He had been transformed into a wolf, a lycanthrope. Yet he had still carried traces of his former cruelty. The cold grey tones of his hair had remained the same, and the violence-filled expression on his face had not faded. His eyes had still shone with the same animal savagery, and even in his wolfish body, he had preserved his old, merciless silhouette. He had now been a despicable creature forced to satisfy the taste for human blood he had nurtured throughout his life upon innocent flocks of sheep. Zeus had known that the destruction of a single palace would not calm his anger. What he had witnessed in Arcadia had proven to him how incurable a wound the world had suffered. When he had returned to Olympus, he had summoned all the immortals to an emergency council in the marble assembly hall. As the king of the gods had sat upon his high throne, leaning on his ivory scepter, he had thundered about the disgusting feast at Lycaon's table and the corruption he had seen. One house has fallen, but it was not the only place that needed to fall, Zeus had said in fury. Savage violence has taken root in every corner of the earth. Humans have seemed as if they had sworn oaths to one another to commit evil. Some of the gods in the council had applauded Zeus's righteous anger with enthusiasm, while others had assented in silent sorrow. Yet all of them had been shaken by the idea that an entire human race would be wiped away. They had fearfully asked who would place sweet-smelling incense on the altars when humanity was gone, and whether the world would become a ruin inhabited only by savage beasts. Zeus had calmed them with a voice like rolling thunder. He had promised that he would cleanse the earth of this corrupted race and replace it with a new people, miraculously created and molded by honesty. At that moment, the king of the gods had first considered drowning the entire world in a hellfire of lightning, but he had worried that the sacred sky and the delicate axis of the universe would be harmed by such a vast blaze. In the hidden pages of fate, a great fire that would one day melt seas and lands had already been written, but that hour of doom had not yet come. For this reason, Zeus had set aside his blazing thunderbolts forged on the Cyclopes' anvils and had chosen a deeper, quieter punishment. A vast and purifying flood that would submerge the entire earth and burst open all the dams of the sky. Lycaon's betrayal in Arcadia had been the final drop that made the patience of the god run dry. Zeus's journey in disguise, though it had searched for even a crumb of goodness, had found only arrogance that challenged the gods and tables drenched in innocent blood. Now the winds in the heavens had begun to change direction, and the clouds had drawn closer to the earth with the weight of lead. Zeus's wrath had been about to descend upon the world as an unstoppable mass of water. The countdown for humanity had ended. The king of Arcadia, who had been turned into a wolf, had been only a small and silent harbinger of the immense catastrophe that was approaching. In the heart of Arcadia's pitch-dark forests, King Lycaon's palace had hosted on that night one of the darkest and most audacious sins in human history. Zeus, the mighty ruler of Olympus, who had descended to earth disguised as a mortal, had found across the table not merely a king, but a cruel tyrant who had attempted to test divinity through the most disgusting and blood-soaked methods imaginable. Zeus, as was remembered, had set out by hiding his ivory scepter and his world-shattering thunderbolts among the clouds in order to personally judge the truth of the foul reports of evil rising from the earth. Yet Lycaon, despite the divine gravity seeping from his guest's presence and the fearful piety of his own people, had mocked this sanctity and had put into motion his ominous plan, either to murder his guest in his sleep or to commit the savagery of offering him a forbidden feast. The king had slit the throat of an innocent captive sent from the people of Molossia with the cold precision of an executioner. He had boiled some of the body parts, which had not yet lost their warmth of life, in bubbling cauldrons, and he had roasted others over glowing flames until the smell of flesh clung to the palace walls. According to some ancient records, this victim had been a child of the king's own blood and his own people. The child's internal organs had been mixed with sacred offerings meant for the gods and had been presented before Zeus as a meal. Lycaon's purpose had been an experiment born at the peak of arrogance. If this stranger had truly been a god, he should have recognized the atrocity placed before him at the very first bite. If he had failed to understand it, then he would have been nothing more than a mortal deserving of death. However, no sin had escaped the eyes of all-seeing Zeus. The moment the foul-smelling dish had reached Zeus's divine senses, the patience of the king of the gods had given way to a rage that shook the cosmos. The instant Zeus had perceived the stain of murder, he had overturned the table with his hands, as if it had been a sheet of paper. At that moment, the silent night of Arcadia had been shattered by the thunder of Olympus's heaviest and most destructive lightning. Zeus had unleashed the flames of vengeance upon Lycaon's palace like a nightmare. Fiery pillars descending from the sky had crushed the roof of this godless king like a gravestone upon his head. Lycaon's sons, who had perished within the palace, and the household gods polluted by the king's sin had been reduced to handfuls of ash by Zeus's thunderbolts. King Lycaon had burst out of his palace in great terror as it collapsed into ruins, and had begun to flee toward the desolate and sinister fields ruled by the darkness of night. He had opened his mouth to cry out in the grip of that deadly fear, perhaps to beg for mercy on his knees. Yet human words had already been choking in his throat. The only sound that had poured from his lips had been a savage howl that echoed through all the forests of Arcadia and froze the soul. The ancient savagery within Lycaon's spirit and his uncontrollable thirst for bloodshed had begun to seize his physical body like a creeping vine. His clothes had suddenly turned into coarse, stiff fur, and his hands, once used to tear apart victims, had transformed into claws that gripped the earth. He had turned into a wolf, a lycanthrope. Even in this new and monstrous body, Lycaon had carried all the marks of his former nature. The graying, icy tones of his hair had now trembled with the same cold sheen in a wolf's pelt. The violent and cruel expression on his face and the savage yellow light in his eyes had not changed at all. Though he had become a wolf, he had still been the same Lycaon. The only difference had been that he now had to quench his hunger not at palace banquets, but by attacking defenseless flocks of sheep like a wretched creature. Zeus had given Lycaon an immortal and horrifying punishment by imprisoning him within the beast that had always lived inside him. For Zeus, this event had been the final straw, the point where patience had ended. The destruction of a single palace had not been enough to soothe the wounded sense of justice of the king of the gods. Zeus had seen that all households, all cities, and all who breathed upon the earth had been swearing dark oaths to one another in order to commit crimes. He had returned to Olympus, to the marble council hall reached by crossing the bright silvery path of the Milky Way, and had gathered all the immortals in an urgent assembly. While he had sat upon his high throne, leaning on his ivory scepter, he had roared to them about the vile feast he had witnessed at Lycaon's table and about the corruption of humanity. When Zeus had struck the ground with his scepter, a cosmic roar had erupted that shook the earth, the sea, and the most distant stars. He had announced his final decision, declaring that he must wipe out the entire human race everywhere the waters of Nereus surrounded the world. A murmur filled with fear and approval had risen among the gods. Some had praised the king's wrath, while others had anxiously whispered about who would offer fragrant incense at their altars if humanity were erased. and whether the beautiful earth would be left solely to the invasion of wild claws. Yet Zeus had calmed them. He had given his ancient promise that this corrupted and defiled race would be completely cleansed, and that in its place a new people would be brought forth, miraculously created, different from the former and virtuous. At first, Zeus had planned to drown the world in a hellfire of massive thunderbolts. However, as had been written in the hidden ledgers of fate, the great doomsday when the entire universe would burn had not yet arrived. Fearing that the pure layers of the sky and the delicate axis of the cosmos would ignite in such a vast blaze, Zeus had set aside his blazing thunderbolts forged on the anvil of the Cyclopes. Instead, he had decided upon a catastrophe that would submerge the entire world, opening all the dams and gates of the sky to their fullest extent, the Great Flood. The north wind, Aquilo, had been imprisoned in the deep caves of Aeolus so that it would not scatter the rain clouds, and the south wind, Notus, the true bearer of rain, had been released with his wet and heavy wings. Iris, the rainbow, had begun to carry water from the seas to the sky to feed the clouds without pause. The countdown for the earth had come to an end. This tragic process, which had begun with Lycaon's transformation into a wolf, had been the first act of the great destruction in which all humanity would be submerged beneath deep blue waters. Zeus's decision had been final. The corrupted, bloodthirsty, and arrogance-drowned generation of the Iron Age would now be buried in silence within the depths of an endless sea. The dreadful howl that echoed through the untouched, pitch-dark forests of Arcadia was the beginning of the end for humanity and the labor pains of rebirth for the universe. As was remembered, Zeus, the king of the gods, had mingled among mortals like an ordinary traveler and had decided to inspect the roots of evil on earth with his own eyes. However, the horrifying feast he encountered in the palace of King Lycaon of Arcadia, the serving of the internal organs of an innocent being, a child as a meal, had finally consumed Zeus's patience, which had endured for centuries like a burning ember. King Lycaon had been made a prisoner of his own savagery and transformed into a wolf, and his palace had been leveled by the wrath of the heavens. Yet this destruction had not been enough for Zeus, for in his eyes not just a single household, but the entire earth had now been defiled by a humanity that had sworn ominous oaths together to commit crime. As Zeus left the dusty roads of the earth and returned to the radiant and unreachable peaks of Olympus, there was a single, unshakable thought in his mind: the complete erasure of that upright race whose soul had grown rusty, once shaped by Prometheus from fresh soil and celestial particles. On Olympus, the highest fortress of the sky, the king of the gods wasted no time and ordered the convening of a great council that would determine the fate of the universe. The path to this sacred assembly was the Milky Way, legendary for its brilliance, which even mortal eyes watched with admiration on the clearest nights of the sky. Along this silvery road, the gods advancing toward the palace of mighty, thunderous Zeus passed in awe through the wide-open doors, golden columns and crowded halls of the distinguished deities on either side. The council chamber was covered with smooth marble that reflected light like a mirror, and every detail bore the seal of divine splendor. This place was the heart of the heavens, the most exalted seat of the elite. It was the center of the universe's governance. When the gods took their places in the marble council hall, their king Zeus sat upon his lofty throne, rising majestically above them all. He leaned on his ivory scepter, the unquestionable symbol of his universal dominion. Before summoning the assembly to absolute silence, Zeus shook his mane, his magnificent and thick hair, 3, even 4 times with his uncontrollable rage. This tremor was so powerful that not only Olympus, but also the deepest pits beneath the earth, the bottoms of the seas, and even the most distant stars trembled before this cosmic fury. Zeus parted his wrath-filled lips, and as his voice echoed through the walls of the marble hall, he recalled the ancient war of the giants. Even in that dreadful time when the snake-footed giants encircled the sky with their 100 arms and threatened my throne, I had not felt greater concern for dominion over the world than I did now, he said, his voice thundering. At least the assault of the giants had come from a single body, from a visible enemy. But now Zeus was fighting a corruption that spread like a plague across the entire world, invisible and everywhere. His decision was as certain as the flow of water. On every shore where the waters of Nereus were heard, in every harbor, I had to eradicate the entire human race at its roots. The tone Zeus used while declaring this radical decision of destruction carried both the cold composure of a judge and the deep hurt of a father betrayed by his own creation. He thought not only of humans, but also of the demigods who had not yet passed through the gates of heaven, the nymphs living in the clear waters of rivers, and the cheerful fauns and satyrs of the forests. For the safety of these innocent spirits who lived among humans, this rotten lineage had to be scraped from the world, he added with fury, especially when a monster like Lycaon had dared to set a trap even for me, who held the lightning in my hand and ruled over you all. When Zeus's speech ended, a great murmur arose in the council hall, resembling the silence before a storm. Some gods enthusiastically applauded their king's anger and encouraged him to carry out this punishment at once. Others remained silent and bowed to this inevitable destruction. Yet in the heart of all of them there was deep sorrow and curiosity. What kind of desolation would cover the earth when humanity was completely erased? Who would place fragrant incense on the altars of the gods? Who would offer sacrifices? Would the world be left solely to the invasion of wild animals and endless weeds? The king of the gods knew how to calm these anxious whispers in the assembly. He promised them that the existing corrupted lineage would be completely cleansed, but that the earth would not remain a graveyard. Zeus gave his divine word that he would bring forth a new people, miraculously recreated, entirely different from the former, virtuous and loyal. Although this promise somewhat eased the unrest in the council, the truly frightening question still remained: by what means would this immense destruction be carried out? In Zeus's hand, the lightning bolts forged by the Cyclopes, powerful enough to shatter even the hardest rocks, stood ready. His first thought was to encircle the entire world with these bolts in a ring of fire and reduce everything to ashes. However, at that very moment Zeus hesitated. He remembered the dreadful prophecy hidden in the ancient writings of fate and in the positions of the stars. A day would come when the seas, the lands, and even the sacred palaces of the sky would ignite, and the massive body of the universe would melt away into a single ball of fire. Zeus feared that if he hurled his lightning recklessly, the pure ether layer of the sky would catch fire, and the delicate axis of the universe would be damaged in this blaze, overturning all cosmic balance. The final hour of the universe had not yet come, and Zeus abandoned fire in order to protect his own kingdom. He set aside his thunderbolts and deadly bundles of lightning. In place of fire, he chose a heavier, quieter, but more relentless weapon: water. It would be a flood that would burst all the dams of the sky, crush the clouds like a vice, and bury the entire world beneath immense cold waves. This decision became the final word of the council. Before Zeus's authority, no god could object any longer. Immediately after the council, the king of the gods began to turn the wheels of destruction. As his first act, he imprisoned Aquilo, the north wind that scattered clouds and cleared the sky, in the deep and dark caves of Aeolus. In his place he released Notus, the south wind, who carried death and endless rains on his wet, heavy wings. Notus enveloped the world like a pitch-black cloak. Water dripped from his beard, and grey, suffocating mists rose from his hair. With every beat of his wings, an ocean poured down from the sky. Meanwhile, the rainbow iris appeared on the horizon with her seven-colored arc as the messenger of Queen Hera. Her task was to gather all the water sources of the earth and feed the clouds in the sky, so that not a single drop of rain would be lacking. A year's labor of the villagers, the golden ears of grain in the fields, and the hopeful prayers of the farmers suddenly mixed into sludge and mud and vanished from sight. Yet Zeus would not be satisfied with the celestial waters alone. He called upon his brother Poseidon, the furious ruler of the seas, for help. Poseidon gathered all the river gods in his magnificent underwater palace and commanded them, "Now, if speech was silver, silence was golden no more. Release all your power. Break the dams, loosen the reins of the rivers, and march upon humanity." At this command, the river gods returned to their beds and began to surge toward the cities like wild horses unleashed from their chains. Poseidon himself also struck the ground with all his might, using his three-pronged trident. The earth shook, and vast bottomless fissures opened to allow the underground waters to burst forth. Rivers swallowed plains. They swept along ancient trees, herds of animals, temples containing sacred objects and innocent children. Even the tops of the strongest buildings disappeared beneath enormous waves, and the tallest towers perished in whirlpools. There was no boundary left between land and sea. The earth had turned into a boundless ocean without shores and without mercy. Thus that great council on Olympus had given the command for the greatest and most sorrowful catastrophe in human history. The gods had bowed to their king, and the fundamental elements of nature had formed a sacred alliance for destruction. Among the millions of people living on Earth, except for a single faithful couple who had listened to the wise whispers of Prometheus, everyone was about to be buried in the silent, cold, and eternal darkness of the approaching waters. On the icy and merciless peaks of the Caucasus Mountains that pierced the sky like a spear, one of the most tragic scenes ever witnessed by the cosmos was unfolding. Prometheus, the creator of humanity, the titan of knowledge rather than arrogance, the son of Iapetus, had been condemned to a horrific punishment decreed by mighty Zeus. His hands and feet had been nailed to the rocks with unbreakable chains forged by the master smith Hephaestus himself. Each day, a colossal eagle descended from the shadows, a creature born of the dark lineage of Echidna and Typhon, and pounced upon the Titan, tearing apart and devouring his divine liver with razor-sharp talons. Yet Prometheus's body repaired itself in the silence of the night. The torn liver grew back, and the torment thus turned into an endless, unbroken cycle. Still, Even amid this unbearable suffering, the Titan had managed to keep his mind free from the chains of Olympus, for his name itself meant the one who foresaw. Even when his eyes closed in pain, he had been able to read, one by one, the still unwritten pages of fate. At that time, the earth groaned under the rusted and ominous decay of the Iron Age. People had left the altars of the gods empty, and devotion had been replaced by deceitful bargains and senseless violence. After witnessing the repulsive human sacrifice feast in the palace of Lycaon, king of Arcadia, Zeus had sworn to wipe the human race from the earth like a speck of dust. Though he had first considered turning the world into a sea of fire with his lightning bolts, he had feared that the delicate axis of the universe might bend in such a blaze, and he had instead decided to drown everything beneath a purifying and colossal flood. Although this divine decision of annihilation had been guarded with great secrecy in the marble halls of Olympus, Prometheus had felt the coming disaster in the deepest core of his soul. From the sharp rocks to which he had been bound, the Titan summoned his loyal son Deukalion, who ruled the lands of Thea, through a call of the mind. Deukalion had been the purest and least corrupted representative of that first noble human spirit Prometheus had shaped from fresh earth and clear water. He had been a ruler who drew his strength not from ambition, but from justice. His wife Pyrrha had been the daughter of Pandora, the first woman, and Epimetheus, and she had earned quiet admiration even among the gods through her piety and unwavering faith. Prometheus had told his son of the terror of the approaching flood in a weary voice that mingled with the whisper of the wind. He had said that the dams of the sky were soon opened over these barren lands where virtue had been abandoned, and that the south wind, Notus, with its wet and dark wings, had turned the world into a vast, silent grave. The Titan had ordered his son, without delay, to build a massive chest, a larnax, and to fill this refuge with the seeds of life and provisions necessary for survival. Deucalion had engraved this wise and frightening warning of his father into his heart, accepting it as a divine command. Returning to Thea, Deucalion and Pyrrha had begun their preparations in deep silence, while the rest of the world drowned in meaningless pleasures, bloody wars, and disputes over property. As the people of the Iron Age carved the land into sharp boundaries and tore into the intimacy of the earth in pursuit of gold's shine, this devout couple had shaped the great wooden chest that was destined to become humanity's last hope. During its construction, Deukalion had followed the measurements impressed upon his mind by his father with absolute precision. This structure had not been a ship meant to cut through waves, nor a boat proud of its speed. It had simply been a sacred box, meant to drift like a seed of life upon the massive and raging waters. As Pyrrha helped her husband in this sacred and exhausting labor, she had filled the inside of the chest with the most resilient crops, the fresh fruits of the soil, and clean waters that would accompany them through the dark days ahead. While they worked in this silent urgency, Astrea the Virgin, the last breath of piety on earth, had long since abandoned the blood-stained world and withdrawn into the sky as a constellation. The heavens now appeared heavier, lower, and more threatening than ever before. Zeus had already chained every wind of hope that might have scattered the clouds within the caves of Aeolus. The world stood in the eerie stillness that came before a storm. Farmers waited for the reward of a year's labor, unaware that all their efforts, prayers, and golden sheaves were about to be swallowed by mud. When Deukalion pulled the heavy lid of the chest shut for the final time, and stepped into this dark refuge with Pyrrha, Iris the rainbow had begun to carry water from the oceans to feed the clouds until they burst. As the son and daughter-in-law of Prometheus waited inside the chest in a silence cut off from the roar of the outside world, the pride of humanity and its endless crimes stood on the brink of drowning beneath the waters. This chest had been not only a shelter, but also the final stronghold of the very idea of humanity that Prometheus had kneaded with his own fingers. Deucalion and Pyrrha, as the only innocent souls who had escaped the wrath of Olympus, surrendered themselves to fate without knowing to which unknown shore the dark waters would carry them. The moment they were sealed inside the chest, Poseidon, lord of the seas, struck the earth with all his might, using his three-pronged trident. Rivers leapt from their beds like unleashed monsters. The world trembled, and the sacred chest built upon Prometheus's warning became the single glimmer of life rising upon the dark waters of universal catastrophe. In the marble halls of Olympus, the echoes of that dreadful decision, which sealed the fate of the universe like a stamp, had not yet faded. Zeus, the king of the gods, had abandoned the idea of turning the world into a ball of fire in order to protect the fragile axis of the cosmos. Instead, he had sworn to drown the human race beneath a vast mass of water that devoured, purified, and silenced everything. This was the final and irreversible punishment to be delivered to the rusted spirit of the Iron Age and to a humanity that had cast aside piety and justice. Deucalion and Pyrrha, having followed Prometheus's ancient warning, had withdrawn into the dark shelter of the chest, Larnax, they had built, listening to the murmur of the world outside, while Zeus prepared to burst all the dams of the sky. Zeus's wrath had gone beyond the limits of words and had turned into a force of physical destruction. His first move had been to shatter the merciful balance of nature at its roots. Turning toward the deep, echoing caves of Aeolus, the master of the winds, Zeus had imprisoned the harsh north wind Aquilo Boreas, which scattered the clouds, cleared the sky like a diamond, and opened the way for the life-giving light of the sun, along with all the cool breezes that chased the clouds in dark vaults. Aquilo's furious, desperate roar, echoing against the stone walls of the cave, had been the bitter herald that the last fragments of hope and the bright mornings on earth had also been chained. Immediately afterward, Zeus had released the south wind Notus, the dark herald of death and unstoppable rain. The moment Notus had broken free of his shackles, he had spread his wet, heavy wings and had glided into the sky like a nightmare. As described in Ovid's ancient lines, the appearance of Notus had been the embodiment of dreadful darkness. His face had been covered with pitch-black smoke, and his beard had hung downward under the weight of the gathered rain. Waters had streamed from his graying, tangled hair like rivers, while his forehead had been wrapped in impenetrable gray mists. Every fold of his wings and garments had dripped a poisonous dew that would drown the ground in mud the instant it touched the earth. When Notus had seized the leaden clouds hanging in the sky with his enormous claw-like hands and had squeezed them with all his strength, the universe had shaken with a terrifying crack. This sound had not been mere thunder. It had been the cry of the water and divine fury within the clouds breaking free from their chains. At once, dense vapors had poured from the heart of the sky, and the infamous downpour, which no mortal had ever witnessed before, and which lashed the earth like a whip, had begun to fall. This had no longer been rain, but a liquid hatred that the gods had spewed onto the world. Yet Zeus had not wanted this flood to be limited only to the waters falling from above. This destruction had to be constantly fed, and the flow of water had not to be allowed to pause even for a breath. At this point, Iris, the messenger of Queen Hera, Juno, and the living embodiment of the rainbow, had stepped onto the stage. Iris had appeared on the horizon in her legendary garment, shimmering with 1,000 colors. This time, however, her arrival had not been to offer a promise of peace after the storm, or a colorful consolation. Iris had drawn all the moisture of the earth, the vapors of the lakes, and the last dampness of the soil into herself like a vast well, carrying these waters upward and ceaselessly nourishing the clouds. Thanks to this endless and ominous circulation, the speed of the rain had not diminished for a single moment, and the sky had collapsed onto the shoulders of the earth with an ever heavier and more suffocating mass of water with each passing second. On Earth, the scene had been the image of all humanity's arrogant history sinking into mud. Farmers, who only days earlier had offered grateful prayers to the gods for a fertile harvest and had plowed their fields with confidence, now saw golden ears of grain laid flat under this merciless scourge brought by Notus, and the fertility of the land had turned into swamps. Every drop of sweat shed over a year had now melted away in the cold waters. Those sacred crops that had once been the focus of prayers and hopes had become no different from worthless piles of rotting waste in the marshes. Villagers, clutching their rakes in helpless hands, had sobbed as they watched the fruits of their barren labor vanish like shadows. Yet their weak cries had dissolved into nothingness amid the thunderous laughter of Notus and the deafening roar of the waters falling from the sky. Meanwhile, Deucalion and Pyrrha, who had avoided the gods' wrath through their piety, had listened to the world's lament from inside the chest they had built. Every heavy raindrop striking the wooden hull of their vessel had been the absolute echo of Zeus's will to turn the earth into a boundless sea without a shore. The waters that Iris had carried upward without rest, and the clouds that Notus had squeezed like a vice, had been preparing the world for the quietest and deepest grave in history. Thus the gates of the sky had been thrown wide open, with Aquilo imprisoned, with the dark cloak of Notus, and with the ominous loyalty of Iris. The end of humanity had officially begun. The rain had intended to uproot and bury deep not only the crops, but also human arrogance, endless ambition, and godlessness toward the gods. In the next stage, Zeus's fury would not have been satisfied with the celestial waters alone. He would have drawn Poseidon, the ruler of the seas, into this purifying destruction as well, inviting the waters beneath the earth to rise to the surface. For now, however, the world had groaned beneath the wet wings of Notus, under the endless lashes descending from the sky. The earth lay beneath that immense mass of water, pressing down like molten lead, silently gasping like a living creature in its final breath. As had been remembered, Zeus had sworn to erase humanity entirely, the humanity that had driven piety and justice from the world with the corroded spirit of the Iron Age. The horrifying sin he had witnessed in the palace of Lycaon, king of Arcadia, had become the final drop that exhausted Zeus's divine patience. Instead of striking the ground with his ivory scepter and burning the world within a ring of fire, he had decided to drown everything in water in order to preserve the delicate balances of the universe. The south wind, Notus, spread his wet and dark wings over the world like a shroud, while Iris the rainbow carried all the moisture of the earth up to the sky to feed the clouds with an endless hunger. Yet Zeus's wrath had been so immense that he had feared the celestial waters alone would not be enough to swallow this vast world. His anger passed beyond the boundaries of the clouds and reached the pitch-black, sunless depths of the seas. Now the turn had come for Zeus's brother Poseidon, also known as Neptune, the lord of the waves and the shaker of the earth. When Poseidon heard his brother's call, he rose like a tower from his magnificent underwater palace, adorned with pearls and woven with coral branches. In his hand he held that terrifying three-pronged trident, forged by the Cyclopes and capable of shaking everything it touched. Neptune accepted his brother's plan of destruction without the slightest hesitation, as if he were paying an ancient debt. He had been the god who shook the lands and swallowed the seas into his belly. Now it was his turn to erase the land entirely from the map. Neptune immediately summoned the river gods who ruled all the rivers and streams of the world to his crystal council. That council gathered in the deafening silence of the deep waters, weighed down by the gravity of the approaching apocalypse. The river gods, Achelous, Alpheus, Peneus, and the others, waited before their lord with trembling waters. Neptune did not need to deliver long or ornate speeches. His voice echoed like the roar of an earthquake rising from the ocean floor. The time for words has passed. Release all your power, break the dams, fling your gates wide open, and loosen the reins of your rivers. Let every stream rush forth as a boundless flood, hurling every obstacle aside like a piece of straw. With that command, the river gods returned to their channels and ran wild like untamed stallions. The gentle streams that had once nourished the soil with a mother's care and given life to farmers' crops had turned into monsters. Fountains spewed water from their mouths like poisonous rivers. The rivers abandoned the faithful beds they had followed for centuries and charged madly toward the open plains, devouring everything in their path. Yet the true devastation came from the seal that Neptune himself struck upon the earth. The Lord of the Seas drove a shattering blow deep into the very heart of the world with his massive trident. The strike was so violent that the earth convulsed with a pain it had never known before, trembling like a body at the moment of death. Bottomless fissures opened in the bosom of the land, and the dark waters of the underworld, imprisoned for thousands of years, burst forth from those cracks like fountains and surged into the light. Water no longer lashed the world only from above. It now besieged it from below as well. The downpours brought by Notus, the clouds fed by Iris, and the rivers unleashed by Neptune merged together and began to sweep away everything before them. The waves first swallowed the painstakingly cultivated crops, the orchards, and the herds of animals. The golden ears of grain that humans had raised with pride vanished within fields turned to mud. Then houses, towering temples, and the sacred objects within them sank into the cold darkness of the waters. Even the strongest structures that had managed to resist that immense destruction lost their roofs to the rising floods. Magnificent towers disappeared silently within the whirlpools. No line remained between land and sea. The world had turned into a single endless sea without mercy or boundary, a sea without a shore. Within this chaotic and surreal landscape, nature betrayed its own laws. Ovid described the terrifying and unbelievable visions of these shoreless seas in this way. A man rowed helplessly in a boat above the fertile field, he had ploughed only moments before. Another sailed over the buried remains of his family's home or his harvest. Some tried to catch fish, swimming among the upper branches of a great elm tree that lay submerged beneath the water, its leaves drifting beside them. The heavy anchors of ships snagged on lush meadows, and the curved hulls of boats scraped past the vines of vineyards as they moved along. Creatures that should have lived in the depths of the sea took the place of the land's former inhabitants. On slopes where graceful goats had once grazed, misshapen seals now rested. The nereids, sea nymphs, drifted in astonishment among submerged cities, ghostly forests and marble palaces. Dolphins plunged deep into the forests, striking the branches of ancient oak trees and shaking them. Order collapsed completely in the wild as well. Wolves struggled side by side in the same current, with sheep they no longer even thought of hunting. Tigers and lions were carried together as companions of fate atop the massive waves. The fearsome tusks of the wild boar or the wind-swift legs of the deer meant nothing against that rising blue wall. Exhausted birds that had searched for days for a single dry branch or patch of land finally surrendered themselves to the embrace of that endless sea, falling into an eternal sleep when their wings could no longer carry them. Even the proud peaks of the mountains could not escape this sacred wrath. Waves battered the summits of Ossa and Pelion, and the immense weight of the water swallowed even the highest points of the world one by one. As millions of people vanished silently among the waves, the few who survived by chance were doomed to die of hunger in the middle of the ocean, with everything around them covered in salt water. At the very center of this cosmic catastrophe, the lone couple whose piety had stirred even a pang in Zeus's heart, Deucalion and Pyrrha, were carried at the mercy of the waves within the small ark they had built at Prometheus's warning. In those dreadful moments when cities were erased from the map, mountains lay submerged, and Neptune's trident had tossed the world like teased cotton. Their small wooden refuge served as a sacred cocoon, carrying the last remaining essence of humankind. Their ark found its own path upon those stormy waters with no harbor, struggling to survive among waves that seemed to touch the sky. When Neptune's fury subsided, and Zeus looked down upon the ruin from above, no trace of human arrogance remained upon the earth. Cities had fallen silent, and rivers had covered the world like a white shroud. The order of the universe had been undone, and everything had returned to that ancient age of chaos. Yet the fissures Poseidon had opened with his trident whispered, ironically, of the path by which the waters would one day retreat. The world had become nothing more than a dark, wet, lifeless void. But Deucalion's ark continued to drift slowly across that eternal sea, on its way to come to rest upon the summit of Mount Parnassus. The world was now unrecognizable. There was no border, no harbor, and not a single piece of land left to set foot on. As was remembered, Zeus, the mighty ruler of Olympus, had sworn to erase the human race from the map in order to put a final end to the endless greed of the Bronze Age people and to the bloody banquet of King Lycaon of Arcadia that had tested divine patience. Although he had first considered turning the world into a lake of fire with his lightning bolts, he had feared igniting the pure ether of the sky and bending the delicate axis of the universe, so he had formed a terrifying alliance with his brother Poseidon, also known as Neptune. Now, heavenly downpours and waters bursting from beneath the earth had completely sealed the surface of the world. The earth had become a vast, merciless sea with no shores. In this chaotic scene, All the rules of nature shaped over millions of years had been overturned, and surreal sights that strained the limits of reason had emerged. As the ancient and secure order of the earth collapsed one by one, humanity's helplessness revealed itself in every wave. A man who only days earlier had proudly plowed his field where golden wheat heads had swayed in the wind, was now desperately rowing a curved boat in the very middle of that land. Another unfortunate soul was sailing directly over ghost-like cornfields, drifting beneath the waves, or over the roof of an ancestral farmhouse that had been completely swallowed by the waters. Even fishing had taken on a form that betrayed its own nature. A fisherman had perched among the highest branches of a massive elm tree that had taken refuge in the water, trying to catch with his hook a fish that had been darting about in confusion among the leaves. At times, by a tragic coincidence, the heavy anchor of a ship had sunk into the middle of a lush meadow, perhaps once a park where children had run and played. The heavy keels of ships had moved forward by crushing the tangled, fruitless branches of vineyards. As the sharp division between mountains and plains faded away, sea creatures had brazenly taken the place of the land's former inhabitants. On those steep and sunlit slopes, where graceful mountain goats had once climbed freely, shapeless, sluggish, wet seals were now resting. The Nereids, sea nymphs, were gliding through the blue depths, watching with deep astonishment the silent cities, enormous forests, and abandoned marble houses beneath the waters. Forests had become the new property of fish. Dolphins had plunged among the branches of centuries-old oak trees, shaking them with their bodies and creating water currents that resembled falling leaves. According to the descriptions of the ancient poet Notus, the sea's massive whales were now leaping over hills and trying to enter the deserted dens of lions on land. The ancient fear and survival instinct that had ruled the wild had given way to a strange and sorrowful fate in the face of the flood's merciless force. Innocent sheep caught in the raging currents were swimming side by side, shoulder to shoulder, with wolves that were too terrified even to imagine hunting them. The waves had dragged tigers and lions into the same whirlpools, leaving the proud kings of the forests to the mercy of the waters. The fearsome tusks of the wild boar that tore through everything, or the swift legs of a deer that once raced the wind, were useless against this rising blue wall. All of them were struggling desperately in the same dark current just to avoid drowning. Exhausted birds, which for days had found not a single dry branch to land on and not one safe valley to take shelter in, had finally surrendered themselves to the cold arms of that endless and deep sea, to an eternal sleep when their wings could no longer carry them. The rising waters had invaded not only the mortal world, but also the sacred balance of sky and earth. The downpours brought by the south wind Notus were so violent that even the Milky Way lighting up the night had seemed whiter and more ominous as it mingled with the foam of the waters. The massive peaks of the mountains were sinking into darkness one by one. Neither the might of Ossa nor the sharp ridges of Pelion had escaped this divine wrath. The sea, with boundless fury, had swallowed even the highest points of the earth. The very few fortunate humans whom the waters had not yet reached were doomed to die slowly and painfully of hunger upon a rock, because no food remained around them, and everything was covered in salt water. In the midst of this cosmic catastrophe, that single pair whose piety and unshakable righteousness had stirred even a pang of mercy in the heart of Zeus, Deucalion and Pyrrha, were struggling against the giant waves inside the small chest they had built. As was remembered, Deucalion, warned by the wise Titan Prometheus, had prepared this larnax chest, filling it with provisions considered the essence of life, and had shut himself inside this wooden refuge together with his wife. Their chest, on those stormy waters with no harbor and no compass, was trying to survive among waves that seemed to touch the sky, as if it were being guided by a divine hand. As they passed over submerged ancient cities, extinguished hearths and vanished nations, they were drifting through this immense silence as the last two breaths left on Earth. During this terrifying drift that lasted 9 days and 9 nights, everything in the world seemed to have returned to that ancient and dark age of chaos. Rivers had strayed from their beds, lost their way, and merged into one another. As Poseidon continued to shake the earth with his three-pronged trident, the world consisted of nothing but water, darkness, and absolute silence. This continued until the small chest of the pious couple gently came to rest on the cloud-piercing summit of Mount Parnassus as the waters slowly receded. This final remnant of humanity was about to open the door to a new and purified world, leaving behind that dreadful vision in which fish had danced in oak trees and wolves had died shoulder to shoulder with sheep. The world had been completely erased under the heavy pallet of divine wrath described in the earlier chapters, and colors and sounds had given way to the suffocating blue of water. Zeus, the ruler of Olympus, had burst open all the dams of the sky in order to destroy the corrupt humanity of the Iron Age so that it would never rise again. Poisonous downpours that streamed from the wet wings of the south wind Notus had merged with the ancient waters that his brother Poseidon had forced up from beneath the earth. As had been recalled at the very heart of this universal apocalypse, that small wooden chest, larnax, built at the warning of the Titan Prometheus, the last hope of the human race, the final seed of life, had drifted upon the savage waves of that endless sea. This humble shelter, which carried Deucalion and Pyrrha within it, had struggled mercilessly against gigantic waves for 9 days and 9 nights upon that dark sea with no shore and no compass. Inside the chest, the couple, separated from the catastrophe outside by nothing more than a thin layer of timber, had listened to the rest of the world sinking into a chilling silence through the roar of water striking the wood. Imagining the collapse of cities together with their towers, the surrender of centuries-old forests to the waters, and the fall of innocent birds, exhausted from days of flight and unable to find a single dry branch to land on, into the sea like mere shadows, they had continually prayed to the gods with the unshakable piety that Prometheus had left them. The waters had risen so high that the chest had sometimes lifted enough to seem to touch the cold light of the silver moon in the sky, and at other times had been pulled down into the pitch-black depths of the enormous whirlpools awakened by Neptunus. At the dawn of the 9th day, the terrifying power of the waters had finally grown weary and had begun to break. Zeus, looking down at the earth from the highest fortress of the sky, had seen that the world was covered entirely by a clear, deep, and silent mass of water. Yet in the midst of that endless blue, he had noticed the single man left from thousands of men and the single woman left from thousands of women. Zeus had known how just and honest the soul of Deucalion had been, and how sincere a reverence Pyrrha, his wife, had held toward the gods. Both of them had been innocent. Both of them had not stopped kneeling and praying, even as the world had come to an end. In the face of this sight, the fury of the heavens had subsided, and had given way to a mercy resembling a father's compassion. The king of the gods had released the cold north wind Aquilo, whom he had confined in the caves of Aeolus, in order to scatter the clouds and sweep the sky clean. As the harsh and purifying breath of Aquilo had dispersed the dirty mists in the sky had once again met the earth, and the earth had once again received the light of the sky. While Zeus had stopped the whip-like rains falling from above, his brother Poseidon had also calmed the waters, which were no longer an angry beast. Setting aside his three-pronged trident, he had invited the waves into stillness. The Lord of the Seas had called upon his son Triton, the god of the depths whose shoulders had been armored with purple shells and seaweed, to help coordinate this immense retreat. Triton had risen to the surface of the foaming waters and had taken into his hand his famous spiraled, hollow and curved seashell trumpet, conch. When the sound of this horn had been blown from the very center of the sea, it had echoed from the farthest horizon where the sun rose to the most secluded shores where it set. As water had streamed from his wet beard, Triton had pressed his lips to the mouth of the shell and had given a universal signal of retreat. At that moment, all waters on land and at sea had bowed to this divine command. The hidden springs that fed the riverbeds had ceased to flow. The waves had calmed like weary soldiers, and the concealed hills beneath the waters had begun to rise again into the light of day. As the waters had diminished, the muddy face of the earth had multiplied like islands, and the rivers had withdrawn into their old and faithful channels. After the long and dark days, the tops of trees had emerged, still bearing the muddy residue and algae of the catastrophe upon them. According to some ancient records, Poseidon had personally split the middle of the Thessalian mountains with his trident, allowing ocean-sized waters trapped within to pour noisily into the sea, and thus had enabled the land to breathe again. The small chest of Deucalion and Pyrrha had gently come to rest upon Mount Parnassus, the famous twin-peaked mountain in the region of Phocis that rose up to the clouds during this miraculous withdrawal of the waters. Opening the lid of the chest with trembling hands and stepping outside, the pious couple had fallen to their knees at the sight before them. The world had now become a ruin wrapped in silence, empty, desolate, and like a corpse from which the soul had been withdrawn. Deucalion had turned to his wife Pyrrha, with tears pouring from his eyes, and, with a trembling voice, had spoken these sorrowful words. "O my sister, O my wife, the only living woman, our shared origin, the bed we shared, and now this great catastrophe we shared had bound us to one another forever. From the rising of the sun to its setting, in all the lands it had seen, only the two of us had remained. The sea had swallowed every other breath." While sobbing, Deucalion had asked who would have comforted Pyrrha's grief if she had survived alone in this sorrowful world. "Believe me, my dear wife," he had said, "if the waters had taken you from me, I would have cast myself into that endless darkness after you." Even in these sorrowful moments, Deukalion had remembered the creative genius of his father Prometheus. "If only my father's sacred art had been in me, so that I could have given life to the earth again, so that I could have shaped this mud back into human form and filled the world with voices." Embracing one another, the couple had mourned for a time in this desolate new world, yet the unshakable piety within them had shown them a single path: to give thanks to the gods and to ask what they were to do in this great silence. With the waters withdrawn, Deucalion had first built an altar and had offered a sacrifice to Zeus, the god of deliverance, Zeus Fixius. While they had knelt on this desolate and windy peak, Zeus had sent Hermes, the messenger of the gods, to reward their piety and had granted them a single wish. Only one desire had torn itself from Deucalion's heart: the restoration of the human race. This chapter had declared that the chaotic flood scenes, in which fish had drifted among oak branches and nature had gone mad, had come to an end, yet had been replaced by the heaviest burden in the world: absolute loneliness. The waters had receded, and nature had returned to its limits at the sound of Triton's horn. However, the world had been completely empty. The solution to the great riddle required for the birth of humanity's new stone-born generation, and the secret of the bones of the Great Mother, would determine the fate of the next chapter. After the merciless darkness that lasted 9 days and 9 nights, after the colossal waves that reached the sky, and the roaring waters that swallowed an entire civilization, the universe had finally been wrapped in an absolute and chilling silence. As had been witnessed in earlier chapters, Prometheus the wise, son of Iapetus, had read the approaching flood in the invisible pages of fate beforehand, and had warned his son Deucalion and his daughter-in-law Pyrrha with a sacred whisper to build a chest, Larnax. This destruction, which Zeus had unleashed because of his anger at the impious atrocities of Lycaon, king of Arcadia, and at the corruption of all humankind, rusted like iron, had wiped away nearly every breath and every hope on earth. Yet these two souls, who had earned quiet respect even among the dwellers of Olympus through their piety and sense of justice, had managed to survive in their small wooden refuge, drifting on the waters like an ownerless leaf. When Zeus, ruler of the heavens, looked down from his lofty ivory citadel at the world that had once been full of life, he saw the earth covered with clear yet soulless, deep yet lifeless waters. He realized that among millions of men, only Deucalion had survived, and among millions of women only Pyrrha had remained alive. Both had been innocent. Both had not lost their devotion to the gods, even as the sky had collapsed upon them. Faced with this sight, the wrath of the king of the gods had given way to an ancient paternal compassion and deep pity. Zeus had released Aquilo, the cold north wind imprisoned in the dark caves of Aeolus, to scatter the suffocating mists of the sky, restoring the earth to the light of the sun and the sky to the scent of the soil. Poseidon, lord of the seas, had followed his brother's merciful decision, set aside his three-pronged trident, and calmed the waves that had neighed like a whipped horse. Poseidon had summoned his son Triton, armored with purple seashells, from the silence of the depths, and had signaled him to blow his horn made from a sacred seashell, as if announcing the end of a war. When the famous retreat sound from Triton's horn had echoed across the world, the raging springs had ceased to flow. The rivers had returned to their beds like shy children, and the mountain peaks had begun to rise one by one from the waters, as if being reborn from the earth. With the miraculous withdrawal of the waters, the small chest of Deucalion and Pyrrha had gently come to rest on Mount Parnassus, the twin-peaked mountain in the region of Phocis that cut through the clouds like a blade. When the heavy lid of the chest had creaked open, the pious couple had taken their first steps outside, and their souls had been shaken by what they saw. The world had become a vast, mute ruin, where rivers had lost their paths, cities had been sealed with grey sludge, and clumps of mud had hung from the branches of trees. From villages that had once echoed with feast songs and from crowded markets, only an emptiness resembling the silence of a grave had remained. Deucalion had clutched his wife Pyrrha's hands in tears. They had been the last two breaths of that ancient world, shaped by Prometheus from earth and heavenly elements. Unable to restrain his sobs, Deukalion had whispered these sorrowful words to his wife. "O my sister, O my wife, the only living woman, our shared origin, the bed we shared, and now this great catastrophe we shared, bound us to each other forever. In all the lands the sun had seen from its rising to its setting, only we remained. Every other breath had been swallowed by the belly of the sea." Deukalion had confessed that the weary clouds still hanging in the sky had frightened him, and he had asked who would have comforted his grief in this vast graveyard if Pyrrha alone had survived. "Believe me," Deukalion had said, "if the waves had separated you from me, I would have joined you in those cold waters." In the midst of this endless desolation, the couple who had not lost their piety even for a moment had first opened their hearts to the gods on the windy summit of Parnassus. Deukalion had offered his gratitude to Zeus, the god of deliverance, Zeus Fixius, and had bowed to the divine will that had spared them from this great disaster. In response to their sincere prayers, Zeus had sent Hermes to this faithful couple and had granted them a wish. There had been only one ache in Deucalion's heart, the revival of the human race. He had wished to possess his father Prometheus's famed creative art and to bring life back to the lifeless clay, filling the world with joy once more. However, the devastation revealed by the retreating waters had been so severe that, as a requirement of their piety, they had decided to consult sacred oracles directly. The couple had set out toward the bed of the Cephissus River, whose waters still flowed cloudy and muddy. As they descended the steep slopes of the mountain, they had passed through ghostly forests where fish had once swum. The leaves still carried the stench of swamp water, and the skeletons of sea creatures left behind by the retreating flood lay scattered. When they reached the banks of the Cephissus, they had followed ancient customs by sprinkling the river's cool waters over their heads and soiled garments, subjecting themselves to spiritual purification. After the purification ritual, they had turned toward the sacred temple dedicated to Themis, the goddess of justice, which at that time had been the center of wisdom and prophecy. This structure, which had once resounded with human prayers and whose altars had never lacked fragrant incense, had now become unrecognizable. The pediments of the temple had been covered with moss, and its once white marble walls had darkened with dampness. Most painfully, the eternal fires that had burned in honor of the gods had been extinguished, and the altars had been wrapped in an icy silence. When they reached the wet steps of the temple, Deucalion and Pyrrha had prostrated themselves on the ground in infinite reverence. They had kissed the cold stones with trembling lips and had been overcome by sobs in the silence of this ruined structure. Deucalion had called out toward the sky for help. "O Themis, if honest prayers could soften the anger of the gods, tell us how humanity could be raised again. Show mercy to this drowned and dying world, O compassionate goddess." At that moment, a divine voice had been heard echoing from the moss-covered walls of the temple, resembling neither a whisper nor thunder. The goddess Themis had given them her famous riddle, which had seemed dark at first glance. "Leave the temple, cover your heads, loosen the belts of your garments, and as you walk, throw the bones of your great mother behind you." At these words, the couple had remained speechless in terror for a long time. Pyrrha, because of her piety and her respect for her ancestors, had rejected this command, thinking that throwing a mother's bones would have been the greatest insult that could be done to a sacred spirit. The thought of disturbing the grave of her own mother, Pandora, had made her tremble. However, Deukalion, son of Prometheus, had possessed his father's ability to unravel the mysteries behind events. After pondering the riddle for a while, he had turned to his wife and had offered this explanation with a glimmer in his eyes. Prophecies are just and never command evil. Our great mother is the earth, Gaia. Her bones are these hard stones on the ground. What the goddess asked of us was to cast behind us the bones of Mother Earth. The world had been a ruin, but this sacred meeting in the temple of Themis had been the hidden promise that life would be reborn from the ashes, or rather, from the stones. Deucalion and Pyrrha, in the middle of the desolate world, holding the bones of Mother Earth in their hands, had taken their first steps toward the most miraculous act of creation in human history. The deathly silence brought by the flood had been about to give way to the footsteps of a new stone-born people and to the reawakening of the earth. After the deafening and relentless flood that had lasted 9 days and 9 nights, the waters had finally receded. Yet the familiar hum of the world had given way to an absolute, chilling silence, as if time itself had come to a halt. As was remembered, Zeus, the ruler of Olympus, had decided to drown the earth because of his rage at the corruption of Iron Age humanity that had penetrated to the marrow, and at the abominable feast of Lycaon, king of Arcadia, which had tested divine authority. From this universal destruction, only Deukalion and Pyrrha had survived, having taken refuge in that small chest, Larnax, the sole sanctuary of life, which had been built upon the warning of the wise Titan Prometheus. When the storm had ended, their chest had come to rest upon the cloud-piercing summit of Mount Parnassus, and this devout couple had remained utterly alone at the very heart of desolation, as the last two witnesses of history. Deucalion had inherited from his father Prometheus not only his name but also his wisdom that perceived the hidden truth behind events and his art of shaping the earth. His wife Pyrrha had been the daughter of Prometheus and Pandora, the first woman on earth. She had been known for her piety and her reverence toward the gods. When the couple had stepped out of the chest and had seen that grey, mud-covered, empty world from which the waters had withdrawn, their hearts had grown as heavy as stone, and they had embraced each other in tears. Looking into the terror in his wife's eyes, Deucalion had cried out his grief, saying, "From the sunrise to the sunset, in all the lands the sun has seen, only we remained. Every other breath the sea swallowed into its belly." Yet this sorrow had not plunged them into darkness. Instead, it had driven them to pursue a divine light. They had descended with heavy steps from the summit of Parnassus toward the banks of the Cephissus River, whose waters still carried muddy sediments. They had sprinkled their garments and their heads with the cold, slowly clearing waters of the river. This had been an ancient ritual requiring the purification of soul and body before reaching the threshold of divine prophecies. Then they had turned toward the temple of the goddess Themis, which had been the most powerful center of wisdom of that age. This sacred structure, once resounding with the prayers of thousands of souls and the smoke of sacrifices, had now been a silent ruin invaded by algae and reeking of marshes. The pediments of the temple had been covered with foul green moss, as if the gods had abandoned the place, The eternal fires upon the altars had turned into dead embers under the cold waters of the flood. When Deucalion and Pyrrha had reached the damp steps of the temple, they had prostrated themselves upon the ground in deep reverence. As they had kissed the cold, wet marble with trembling lips, Deucalion's voice had echoed through the empty corridors of the temple. O compassionate Themis, if honest prayers could soften the wrath of the heavens, whisper to us how we could give life again to this speechless world, how we could revive the human race, help this drowned and breathless world. At that moment, among the moss-covered columns of the temple, a divine voice had been heard, resembling the whisper of the wind, yet shaking heaven and earth with its authority. The goddess Themis had presented them with one of the darkest and most difficult riddles in history to solve. Leave the temple, cover your heads with a veil, loosen the belts of your garments, and as you walk, throw the bones of your great mother behind you. Upon these words, the couple had become like statues in the deep silence of the temple, for the command they had heard had been horrifying to a devout heart. The first to break the silence had been Pyrrha, who had been unable to restrain her sobs. As the daughter of Pandora, with her unshakable loyalty to the spirit of her mother and her ancestors, she had absolutely refused to carry out this command. With a trembling voice, Pyrrha had begged the goddess for forgiveness, for to desecrate her mother's grave and scatter her bones upon the road had been a sin more dreadful than the flood itself. In her mind, this command had been the greatest assault upon holiness. Deucalion, however, had activated the intellect of Prometheus, the foreseeing one, and had lived up to his name. Unlike his wife, he had known that the gods would never command an evil act. He had examined every word of the riddle in his mind with the meticulous care of a jeweler. Prophecies are just and never command evil, he had whispered to himself. If this had not been a sin, then the concepts of Great Mother and bones had to point to another truth. Suddenly a divine gleam had struck Deucalion's face, and turning to his wife, he had excitedly unlocked the riddle. My dear Pyrrha, either I am mistaken, or the intelligence I inherited from my father does not deceive me. Our true Great Mother is this vast earth that carries and nourishes us all in her bosom, Gaia, and these hard stones on the ground are her ancient bones. The goddess is asking us to cast behind us these unbending bones of the earth, that is, the stones. Pyrrha had hesitated for a moment before this wise and heart-relieving interpretation of her husband. Although a faint trace of doubt had still lingered within her, she had decided to take refuge in Deucalion's clear mind and in the justice of Themis. Even so, neither of them had known whether this ominous trial would truly come to life. Yet in a desolate world, what else had remained but to try? They had left the temple, covered their heads with thick veils as Themis had commanded, and loosened the knots of their garments to free their bodies. Then they had taken handfuls of stones from the mud, and as they had walked with heavy steps, had begun to throw them backward over their shoulders. At that moment, the most magnificent miracle of creation that humanity had ever witnessed had occurred. Those cold, lifeless, and hard stones that had been cast behind them had begun to soften miraculously the instant they had touched the ground. The sharp and savage edges of the stones had rounded off, and their sizes had grown as if a soul had been breathed into them. Just as a crude clay statue took shape in the hands of a master, the stones had slowly assumed human form. As the moist and earthy parts within the stone had turned into soft flesh, and the hard and unbending parts had turned into strong bones, the fine veins within the stone had taken their place as the life-pumping veins of humans. Before long, every stone thrown by Deukalion had turned into a man, and every stone thrown by Pyrrha had turned into a woman. This new stony race of humanity had enabled the world to come back to life after the great destruction brought by the flood. The solving of Themis's riddle had not only ended the silence upon the earth, it had also proven that when piety and intelligence were united, even the darkest apocalypse could be transformed into a new spring. The world had no longer been a mud-covered graveyard. Every stone that had fallen from the hands of Deukalion and Pyrrha had become the seed of future civilizations. Every time Deukalion and Pyrrha had looked behind them and had seen the stones come to life, rise and breathe one by one, they had given thanks to the gods. This new lineage, endowed with the unshakable resilience of having been born from stone, had been equipped with a will of steel against life, labor, and every kind of hardship. The bones of the Great Mother, united with the fertility of the earth, had brought humanity forth again from stone, and history had begun to be written anew upon those muddy shores where the waters had withdrawn. On the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the dignified silence that had endured for centuries was, this time, about to host the greatest and most mysterious miracle in history. As was remembered, Zeus, the mighty ruler of Olympus, had decided to wipe the entire human race from the face of the earth because the people of the Bronze Age had strayed from piety and because of the bloody, disgusting feast by which King Lycaon of Arcadia had tested divine authority. The earth had been drowned by a relentless flood that lasted 9 days and 9 nights. Ancient cities, marble temples, and great forests had been swallowed by the dark belly of deep waters. However, Deucalion and Pyrrha, who had taken refuge in a small chest, Larnax, built upon the warning of the wise Titan Prometheus, had been the only innocent souls to survive this universal catastrophe. When the waters receded, the world had turned into a desolate ruin covered in mud, and the pious couple had gone to the temple of the prophetic goddess Themis to ask how the human race could be saved from this silence. The goddess Themis had given them her famous mind-confounding riddle. Leave the temple, cover your heads, loosen the belts of your garments, and as you walk, throw the bones of your great mother behind you. As had been seen in the previous chapter, Pyrrha had been horrified by the thought of throwing a mother's sacred bones. However, Deukalion, the clever son of Prometheus, had solved the riddle by realizing that the Great Mother was the earth, Gaia, and that the bones were the hard stones lying on the ground. Now on the steep slopes of Parnassus, beside the still turbulent and sorrowful waters of the Cephissus River, Deukalion and Pyrrha understood that the time had come to carry out this prophecy. The world waited silently, filled with the heavy, wet smell of soil revealed by the retreating waters and layers of mud. Deukalion, remembering those ancient times when his father Prometheus had shaped the first human form by kneading earth and heavenly water, reached his hand toward the cold rocks on the ground. The softening of the stones and the first human forms. Both of them covered their heads with thick veils, just as Themis had commanded. This had been a silent sign of deep reverence and absolute humility felt in the presence of a divine act of creation. They loosened the knots of their garments one by one, for they had not wanted any bond or knot to restrain their souls and bodies during this sacred and free moment of creation. Deukalion and Pyrrha filled their palms with the muddy stones on the ground and began to walk side by side across the desolate, wet plain. Deucalion threw the first stone over his shoulder, back toward that silent past. Immediately afterward, Pyrrha cast her own stone with faith in the future. At that very moment, the most magnificent transformation ever witnessed by the ancient ages began. The hard, solid, and lifeless stones thrown behind them began to lose their unyielding rigidity the instant they touched the ground. The pieces of rock softened, stretched, and expanded in size, as if they were being forged by an invisible fire, and took on distinct forms. This change resembled rough marble figures newly released from a sculptor's hands, whose outlines had not yet fully sharpened. The damp and earthy parts within the stones turned into soft, warm flesh, like metals transformed in the hands of an alchemist. The hard core of the stone evolved into strong bones that would support the human body. Even more astonishingly, the ancient veins and fibers within the stone retained their place as life-pumping human veins, becoming ready for the first life fluid to flow through them. The birth of men and women. Each stone thrown by Deucalion took the form of men rising from the earth, with broad and powerful shoulders. Unlike the weak and corrupted race erased by the flood, they were a new generation that would carry the endurance of stone and the loyalty of the earth in their veins. The stones cast over Pyrrha's shoulders by the same miracle turned into graceful and dignified women. This new humanity, the stony race, began to break the chilling silence of the earth with their first breaths and first heartbeats. This process of creation occurred so quickly and with such divine power that every time they looked back, they saw more people rising to their feet across the plain, coming to life one by one. Through their piety, Deucalion and Pyrrha had become instruments of this miraculous creation of Zeus. From then on, humans began to be called laos, derived from the Greek word laos, meaning stone, and signifying the people who came from stones. With the patience born of their stony origin, this new race would endure every hardship in the rebuilding of the world, and would once again teach the earth the sanctity of labor. The spontaneous revival of nature and Python. While humanity was being recreated through this miracle, other living species on Earth were experiencing a different kind of birth struggle. The receding floodwaters had left behind a rich and fertile layer of mud, diluvian ooze, in the valleys. When the sun appeared again from behind the clouds and began to warm this moist soil, a hidden fermentation started in the heart of nature. Thanks to that discordant concord of heat and moisture, the earth began to create thousands of animal species on its own. The union of fire and water became the key to life. Mother Earth, Gaia, reshaped familiar creatures while also producing beings never seen before. However, this uncontrolled creativity also brought terror. In one of the deep valleys where damp marshes met the burning heat of the sun, a massive serpent of unprecedented size took form, Python. This creature was the symbol of the primal power born from mud, and it spread fear across the world until it eventually met the arrows of the sun god Apollo. As Deucalion and Pyrrha looked upon the gathering crowd of the stone-born on the plain, they knew that their loneliness had ended and that a new chapter in human history had begun. Stones had turned to flesh, and bones had returned to their true form. The world was no longer an empty ruin, but a sacred garden where hope had taken root. Descending from the dignified peaks of Mount Parnassus, whose summits cut through the clouds like blades, toward the silent and desolate valleys where the waters had only just receded, Deucalion and Pyrrha witnessed the lifeless stones they had left behind begin, one by one, to breathe and transform into human beings. As was remembered, Zeus, the king of the gods, had sent a universal flood to erase from history the corrupted and impious humanity of the Iron Age. However, this devout couple, having built a chest, Larnax, upon the warning of the wise Titan Prometheus, had managed to survive. Thanks to the famous riddle they had solved at the temple of the goddess Themis, "Throw the bones of the Great Mother behind you," the stones on the ground had turned in Deucalion's hands into men as hard as steel, and in Pyrrha's hands into dignified women. This new generation, endowed with the unshakable resilience that came from being born of stone, began to repopulate the earth as a stony race, resistant to pain, hardship, and labor. When the waters had completely withdrawn, and the rivers had returned to their ancient beds, Deucalion and Pyrrha settled in the city of Olympus, in the region of Locris, in order to establish their first permanent home. There, upon the freshly washed soil shaped by the floodwaters, not only those born from stone, but also the biological children of Deucalion and Pyrrha themselves began to open their eyes to the world. The eldest and most magnificent of these children was Hellen, who carried in his veins his father's piety and ability to rule. Although some ancient whispers had claimed that Hellen's true father had in fact been Zeus, he had always been accepted as the legitimate heir and honor of Deucalion. Hellen had been such a powerful and wise ruler that he had united all the local tribes, which until then had been scattered under different names beneath a single roof, and had given them the name Hellenes, derived from his own. Hellen's legacy had not consisted merely of a name or a title. He had been the true architect who laid the political, moral, and cultural foundations of this new civilization born from ashes. Hellen married the water nymph Orsis, and from this sacred union, 3 powerful sons were born who would seal the fate of Greece like a mark: Doris, Xuthus, and Aeolus. In the final years of his life, Hellen divided the lands he ruled among these 3 sons, thereby sowing into the soil the seeds of the future great tribes. Hellen's tomb continued centuries later to rise as a symbol of pride in the marketplace of the city of Melite, while his memory was revered as that of the ancestor of the new humanity. Of Hellen's sons, Doris seized the lands opposite the Peloponnese with the authority he had inherited from his father, and left his own name as a legacy to the people there, calling them the Dorians. The Dorians took their place on the stage of history as the most warlike, most disciplined, and most unyielding branch of the Hellenic lineage. The other son, Aeolus, ruled over the fertile regions around Thessaly, and named his people the Aeolians. The line of Aeolus was so prolific that through his 7 sons and 5 daughters, it formed the origin of some of the most famous kingdoms and heroic tales of Greek mythology. Sisyphus founded Corinth and raced against the winds, while Salmoneus proclaimed his own kingdom in Elys. Thus the descendants of Deucalion spread across the entire Greek world like ivy. Xuthus, the 3rd son of Hellen, turned toward the Peloponnese by his father's command, and there united bloodlines by marrying Creusa, the daughter of Erechtheus, the king of Athens. From this marriage, Xuthus had 2 sons, Achaeus and Ion. These 2 grandsons expanded their grandfather Hellen's legacy even further, and gave their names to the tribes of the Achaeans and the Ionians. Ion, in particular, left his mark on the region of Attica, and later on the lands that would bear his name, Ionia, thereby forming the origin of the seafaring and artistic Ionian people. Thus, that small and trembling spark of hope that had emerged from Deucalion's chest turned, through Hellen and his sons, into a vast civilizational fire that illuminated the world. Deucalion and Pyrrha had not only Hellen but also other children, and they too played decisive roles in shaping the new world. Their second son, Amphictyon, ruled in the region of Attica and became one of the wisest leaders in the early history of Athens. Their daughter Protogenia, from her union with Zeus, gave birth to Ethlius. Ethlius later came to be known as the first king of the region of Elis and the father of the great hero Endymion. Thus, the lineage of Deukalion took root as far as the lands where the sacred Olympic Games began. During this process, the world was filled not only by humans, but also by other living beings that Mother Earth, Gaia, had created spontaneously. As the sacred heat of the sun dried the damp post-flood mud, animals, birds, and even monstrous creatures such as the giant python regained physical form. This time, however, the earth held a human race as hard as stone, as adaptable as water, and endowed with a divine quality, capable of confronting these challenges. When Deucalion and Pyrrha grew old, they closed their eyes in peace, having seen that the new world they had established was secure and just. Pyrrha's tomb took its place in Locris, while Deucalion's tomb stood near the temple of Olympian Zeus that he himself had built in the heart of Athens. The legacy of the flood of Deucalion was not only a physical recreation, but was told for centuries as a universal lesson and a story of virtue. Poets passed down from generation to generation how stones had softened and turned into warm flesh, and how the constellation Aquarius had in fact represented the devout Deukalion, the master of the waters. In contrast to the arrogant and corrupted humanity before the flood, this new generation placed piety and justice at the center of civilization. Every stone cast by Deukalion was, in truth, an eternal proof of humanity's ancient resilience and of divine will. Thus, this great epic, stretching from the darkness of chaos to the waters of the flood, and from the flood to the dawn of a stone-born people, reached its peak with the magnificent kingdoms founded by Hellen and his sons. Humanity rose once more, cities rose upon stone foundations, and nature was filled again with the joyful laughter of life. The time that passed from the silent waiting within Deucalion's chest to the glorious days when Hellen inscribed his name upon the golden pages of history became the greatest proof that even the harshest wrath of the gods could turn into mercy and new life in the face of unshakable piety. The lineage of Hellen spread across every corner of the earth and initiated that unique civilization which would preserve forever the legacy of piety, art, and warfare. On the damp, mud-scented and silence-covered slopes of Mount Parnassus, every stone that Deukalion and Pyrrha hurled backward over their shoulders in obedience to the prophecy of the goddess Themis had in fact ignited not only a new lineage of humanity, but also the archetypal light of human consciousness that would not fade for thousands of years. At the end of this epic journey, what remained in our hands was not merely an ancient Greek text or the masterful verses of Ovid. What remained was that ancient memory hidden in the deepest layers of the human soul, showing how religions, myths, and folkloric fears intertwined with one another like ivy. The flood, the animation of stones, human corruption, and divine wrath were not stories belonging to a single geography. They were universal reflections of humanity's existential anguish. The faint ray of hope that filtered from Deucalion's chest had in fact been the same celestial compass that had guided Zeus in the scorching deserts of Mesopotamia, Noah in the pages of the Bible, and Manu in the Indian epics. This deep and unshakable overlap among mythologies and religions had demonstrated that humanity had been a vast river fed from a single source. The similarities between the flood of Deukalion and the flood of Noah had symbolized, beyond simple cultural interaction, the collective unconscious need for purification. In both narratives, humanity had betrayed the divine spark it possessed, and surrendering to the cold and selfish ambitions of the Iron Age had driven universal justice, Astrea, from the world. The fury of Zeus that sealed the heavens, together with the motifs of divine punishment in ancient religions, had reminded humanity that it had to pay the price for the audacity of overstepping its limits and defying its creator, that is, hubris. Yet the image of the ark that rose from within this destruction had emphasized that faith and piety had been the only refuge capable of transcending every material catastrophe. What had been striking was that these narratives had nourished one another, not only in their main outlines, but also in their details. The return of Noah's dove with an olive branch and Deucalion's observation of the receding waters had been universal symbols of nature's desire to reconcile with humanity. Lycaon, whom we encountered at the beginning of the story, and his punishment of being transformed into a wolf, had constituted the purest and oldest origin of the dark archetypes known today in popular culture as werewolves, lycanthropy, or vampirism. Lycaon had represented not merely the punishment of a king, but the metaphorical manifestation of the savagery and bloodlust within human nature. Lycaon's transformation into a wolf after attempting to test the gods by offering human flesh had in fact illustrated how the animal impulses beneath humanity's civilized mask could devour the entire self if left uncontrolled. The uncontrolled violence and moon-triggered ferocity seen in werewolf legends had actually been a continuation of Lycaon's impious and dark banquet. Similarly, the connection to vampirism myths had been hidden here as well. The hunger for blood, the desire to steal life energy, and the struggle to survive at the expense of another's life had been equivalent to the false power Lycaon had sought to obtain by trampling the divine. These figures, which appeared in the modern world as vampires or werewolves, had in fact represented humanity's endless struggle with the Iron Age monster within itself. This magnificent intersection of religions and myths had reached its peak in the definition of stone-born humanity. The softening of the stones thrown by Deucalion and Pyrrha and their transformation into flesh had been directly related to the motif of creation from earth in the Abrahamic religions. In the Quran, the Gospel, and the Torah, humanity had been described as being shaped from clay, from the essence of the soil. The hardness of stone had symbolized humanity's resilience in the face of worldly hardships, while the veins within the stone turning into human veins had symbolized lifeless matter gaining life through a divine breath, that is, the soul. At this point, there had been no ontological difference between the animation of stones in Greek mythology and the creation stories in Islam or Christianity. Humanity had been a part of the earth, and its fate had been sealed with this soil. This stone lineage, though it had appeared physically fragile, had carried within it the immovability of mountains and the endless patience of the earth. This led us to the legacy of Hellen and the reflections of this legacy in the modern world. Hellen's unification of different tribes under a single name had been humanity's effort to rediscover a common language and identity after a dispersion similar to the Tower of Babel. In today's world, despite the deep chasms created by beliefs and ideologies, all of us had in fact been born of stones. The similarities in the rituals of different religions, such as purification with water, offering sacrifice and praying, had proven that all of us had knelt with the same fear on the slopes of Parnassus and had looked to the sky with the same hope. The first altar established by Deucalion had been the ancestor of all temples today. What had been called interfaith dialogue had actually been nothing more than the remembrance of this ancient kinship. Every religion had offered an ark to the human soul, struggling to survive its own flood, and every belief had aimed to soften the hard, emotionless stone within humanity and transform it into a compassionate heart. In this era in which the modern world had evolved into a modern Iron Age and Astrea justice had been replaced by a technological coldness, Lycaon's bloodlust had continued to live on in new forms. Wars, exploitation, and the disrespect for another's right to life had in fact been examples of modern vampirism. A system that had drained the labor, peace, and lives of others had been no different from the ominous feast Lycaon had offered to the gods. Yet the story had not ended here, because there had always been a Deucalion and a Pyrrha. They had been those who did not succumb to the ambitions of the crowds, who did not lose their piety and justice, and who quietly built their own ark. The stones they had thrown had continued to mingle among us as the voice of conscience, and had continued to make us human. In conclusion, this epilogue had not been an ending, but an understanding. The flood of Deucalion had to be read not merely as a natural event or a mythological narrative, but as the difficult trial the soul had to pass through. That sacred cluster of intersections, where religions and myths touched one another, had been humanity's map of salvation. Stones had turned into flesh because love and justice had been able to soften even the hardest substance. Werewolves and vampires had been among us because savagery and ambition had been the animal sides of us awaiting discipline. The flood could have occurred at any moment because corruption had always been at the door. Yet on the summit of Parnassus, the legacy of that pious couple who had waited with hope, holding a piece of stone in their hands, the spirit of Hellen, meaning reason, virtue, and the consciousness of unity, had always carried us toward a new dawn. Humanity, within this eternal cycle, had continued to write its own epic with the patience of stone and the fire of the soul. We had been the future given life by the past that had been thrown over our shoulders, and this miracle would not have faded until the last stone had been cast. I hope that as you end your day, this ancient epic has been a good story for you. I look forward to your comments and requests. Do not forget to follow my channel. May the darkness of the night and the rhythm of the sea bring you peace. Until we meet again in another legend, in the breath of another hero. Love.